Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you, Mr President. I rise to contribute to this debate on the motion moved by Senator Payne today, and in doing so want to extend my sympathies and my heart to everybody who is being impacted by the horror that we've seen unfold over the last couple of weeks in Afghanistan. Those that are there fleeing for their lives, those that are here desperate to know whether their families are safe, desperate to know what the future will hold. In 20 years, Australia's longest war, we've been engaged in Afghanistan. Of course, we went in following the United States, Australia again not having an independent foreign policy, led there by John Howard in a war that arguably we could never win. Let's remember the purpose of this military action from the beginning. Right at the beginning was to hunt down Osama bin Laden, was to attack terrorism. It wasn't initially about freeing women or children or bringing democracy to Afghanistan. It wasn't about rebuilding civil society. And the biggest problem right there was that you can't beat terrorism purely with military response. It requires political, civil society and a humanitarian strategy. None of these were at the core of the United States and the coalition forces at the beginning. Some would argue that, in fact, over the last decade, things have become more unsafe in Afghanistan, less free for those who had such great hopes for a reborn nation. And to that point, Mr President, I'd just like to acknowledge that the Greens have serious reservations about some of the elements of this motion, that it takes a rose-glasses view of Australia's role in Afghanistan. We can't discount the failures that have occurred over the last 20 years. And the toll on Australia has been great. 41 lives lost in combat, 260 wounded, and over 500 veterans have tragically taken their own lives. Thousands and thousands more, Mr President, still suffer the effects of PTSD. But of course the toll has been largest and hardest felt on the people of Afghanistan. It has been enormous, long-lasting and tragic. Tens of thousands of innocent lives lost, hundreds of thousands of people displaced and families torn apart. And of course, like always in war and combat, it is women, children and minorities that are the hardest hit by these conflicts. The longest war has had a long and tragic and harrowing impact on the people of Afghanistan. The hundreds of thousands of people who have fled across borders to escape oppression and violence in the search of freedom from military actions, death and torture. For 20 years, Australia has played a role in this bloody war. I was remembering last week that right in this place, after the 2010 election, one of the things that the Greens negotiated with the Gillard government was a commitment to debate the Afghan war in this place, in the parliament, every year, as a commitment to not forgetting the real impact of this conflict, as a commitment to debating the merits of our actions, to not forgetting the sacrifice of Australians and others involved in this action, and to not forget the very people whose lives this war was impacting the most. And that debate and that commitment for a debate, that happened in October in 2010, and it happened again in November of 2011, and again in October in 2012. But then that was it. When the Abbott government came to power, this parliament stopped debating this important war. This parliament stopped debating the merits of why we were there. As members of parliament, it wasn't at the forefront of all of our minds. And that, Madam Acting Deputy President, is a shame. Because it is not without debate that we are able to consider the best ways forward. And over the last 2 weeks, we've seen the horror unfold in Afghanistan and thousands of people fleeing for their lives. And we've asked the question, should Australia have done more? What was the exit strategy? How were we going to get people out? What was the evacuation plan? Well, this parliament should have been debating those issues regularly, passionately, honestly. And we just haven't been. And that's not good enough. Our veterans, our diplomats, our Afghan friends in Afghanistan and here on Australian soil deserve better of this parliament. They deserve better from this government in relation to planning, talking and being honest about our involvement. It's 20 years of Australia's involvement in Afghanistan, and this week marks 20 years since the Tampa, that famous Norwegian boat that was stopped by the former Prime Minister John Howard, holding over 400 refugees and asylum seekers, mostly Afghan nationals. And that, of course, was at the beginning of a huge diplomatic and political row in this country over how we treated people when they were fleeing horrible regimes like the Taliban. And it set a marker for how we respond to those in need. And I put to you, Madam Acting Deputy President, that it's been a pretty shameful history ever since. And it is not lost on me, as we stand here and debate this issue and what should be done to help those who are still left fearing for their lives in Afghanistan, that 20 years ago our government turned their back on the very same people fleeing the very same regime. We need to do better. And that is why the Prime Minister's commitment of 3,000 humanitarian places within our existing program is simply not enough. It is why the slow drip, drip, drip of getting people out of Afghanistan who have worked alongside us and their families has not been good enough. And it is why the Prime Minister's refusal to grant permanent protection to the 4,500 Afghans who are here in Australia already, giving them an opportunity to get on with their lives, to be free of that constant threat of ever having to face the Taliban again. What unnecessary cruelty to have that limbo hanging over people's heads when there is absolutely no need to. It is unnecessary and it's mean-spirited. And if we have not learnt anything for the last 20 years, my gosh, what on earth have we been doing? I don't buy for 1 second, and I'm sure, Madam Acting Deputy President, not one person in this chamber buys it either. The spin from the Taliban this week that they have changed their approach, that they will treat women and girls properly, that Hazaras will be able to live free from oppression and persecution. I don't believe it, and I'm sure you don't either. So what are we going to do about it? We at least have to take on board our moral obligation, commit to taking and helping those and their families who stood alongside us, who helped us. Allow those that are already in Australia to bring their families here, and to play our role in the international community of acknowledging that this is a humanitarian crisis and we need to do more. Minister Payne and Senator Wong both acknowledged that as members of parliament, our offices have been inundated with heartbreaking stories of people who are living in fear right now, of people who are worried about the fact that they haven't had a phone call or a text message returned in the last 12 hours and they don't know if their family is still alive. And as the situation outside of the airport deteriorates even further, that fear is only growing. Well, there are moments like this that happen in a Prime Minister's leadership where a Prime Minister can decide to do the right thing. And I plead with Mr Morrison, don't be stubborn about this. This is a humanitarian crisis. These are people's lives, people we owe an obligation to, people we should help because it's the right thing to do. Don't be pig-headed about this. Show some leadership and show the compassion that our Defence Force, that our diplomats, that our humanitarian workers have all been showing and been committed to for the last 20 years. It doesn't take much to do the right thing. You just have to show a bit of compassion and have a little bit of heart. And I urge the Prime Minister to do that today.